There are two senses of the word picturesque. The first, which goes back through Italian and French humanism and is consistent with all the ut pictura formulas, means like a picture. The other, which arose during the course of the British 18th century, reflected trends in landscape gardening and painting, supported the rise of scenery tourism, and was asserted as one aesthetic category among others, the sublime and the beautiful, most notably by William Gilpin, followed by Uvedale Price and Sir Richard Payne Knight. The main criteria for this specific aesthetic were texture, variety, rural human figures, and scenery often borrowed from Northern European landscape painters like Ruisdael and Jean Racine painters in the tradition descending from Bruegel, all of it called barnyard imagery by its detractors. In those contrasting sketches, these contrasting sketches from A Guide to the Picturesque by Gilpin, who was a very poor draftsman, you can get the idea. In British painting of the time, the effects of the picturesque aesthetic can be felt most clearly in Gainsborough's landscapes. A cow is a very picturesque animal, and Gilpin tells us that two cows aren't enough unless a third is very close to them, much to the amusement of today's cartoonist Gary Larson. Larson assumes, for the purpose of his joke, that modern scenery tourists still favor the pedantries of the picturesque aesthetic. But it has to be admitted that the necessary distinction I'm making between like a picture and like one particular kind of picture is not always as definite as I've suggested, even in the 18th century. The meeting point of the picturesque's two meanings, even in Gilpin, as John Dixon Hunt insists, is like a good picture, like any good picture. Henry Tilney in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey at the turn of the 19th century instructs the heroine about a given landscape's capability of being formed into pictures. And that criterion is made deliberately to extend back, as Martin Price points out, to the gardening capability of Capability Brown, the mid-century landscaping entrepreneur whose smooth terrains and clumps of foliage all the late century picturesque theorists despised. Capability Brown, as you can see, was the father of the golf course. Jane Austen is resisting the recent narrowing of landscape taste by picturesque theorists, thus returning not just to Brown, but also to the beginning of the 18th century, when in Alexander Pope's notes to his Homer translations, for example, the word picturesque still definitely means like a good picture, whether of people or scenery. But now I come to my question, which leaves the 18th century aesthetic subcategory called the picturesque aside altogether. Is there an un-picturesque? After all, perhaps like a good picture is implied in like a picture, but it is only implied. When we distance ourselves from aesthetic appreciation, as so much modern art and medial experimentation has tried to do for various reasons, then it becomes clear that absolutely anything visible, whether to the eye or to the inner eye, is capable, to borrow Jane Austen's term, of being a picture. This is what the painter over whom I will finally pause, Gerhard Richter, has said repeatedly, though there are times during his enigmatic interviews when he only means that anything unappealing, like a roll of toilet paper or a bourgeois chandelier, can be made attractive, or at least compelling. Already in Leon Battista Alberti, in any case, it's clear that the eye itself is like a window, which is to say that it frames what it sees. For Alberti, this is a vanishing point perspective window, and current theorists like Anne Friedberg want to say that the digital revolution has redefined the window as windows, a multiple simultaneity. I think that overstates the matter, by the way. You can only focus one window on your desktop in a given instance, and that particular window is still Albertian, a finestra aperta. In any case, as Friedberg agrees, we see everything in a frame. Clement Greenberg's insistence on painting self-reference as a depthless two-dimensional plane in non-figurative modernism simply shifts what is framed from perception to expression. Martin Jay and Friedberg, among others, point out that for Johannes Kepler and subsequent optical theorists, the retinal apparatus processes a framed image by turning it upside down and writing it again, like a camera obscura. The retinal frame itself is constantly moving, both as the gaze shifts and as images shift, hence differing from the borders of a fixed screen within which images shift, yet closer nevertheless to the cinematic than to painting and photography with their fixed frames and images. But for the eye, unlike other media for moving images, there is a certain conservatism of movement. When we turn our heads, the eye tends to lag behind to preserve what it has seen earlier before it catches up with the new gaze to which it has been drawn. Also, as Jay points out, what the eye does much of the time, when not following a moving object across a visual field, is to move rapidly from fixed point to fixed point in what are called saccadic movements, or jerks, thus seeing one picture after another in quick succession, like a scanner of paintings or photographs along a gallery wall. The film camera, or editor, can do this too. But the spectatorial eye, in response to cinema's saccadic movements, stays focused within the fixed borders of a screen. Despite these qualifying differences, however, as long as some formula like ut pictura spectare seems adequate, one may rest content with parallels between picturing and seeing, with the question, is there an un-picturesque, having already been answered in the negative. As my title probably implies, I do feel that it should be answered in the negative and must be, unless we insist more narrowly that what we mean by a picture is an image that is aesthetically appealing. There have always been devices that help the eye organize what it sees according to aesthetic standards, by imposing grids or by reinforcing light and shade while superimposing a frame like a Claude glass. But these devices bring out the aesthetic appeal of an image that is already like a picture, however much it might be improved. Just try telling conceptual artists and artists in other ways anti-aesthetic that their work is beautiful. They hate that and go to enormous lengths of sloppy workmanship to avoid the charge. I'm not sure, in fact, that picturing can escape the aesthetic, if only because there are aesthetics of the ugly, the grotesque, the campy, the pretty, the horrific, and so on. And here again, speaking in agreement with what Gerhard Richter often says. Yet it is not only the aesthetic that it's difficult to escape. Underlying the aesthetic, and even more fundamental to representation itself, or figuration. This was Picasso's point when in 1935 he attacked abstraction, meaning non-figurative art, as a futile dereliction from the duty of painting. In trying to avoid figuration, he argued, you leave painting without a purpose, because the only possible purpose of painting is to start from something seen. In his defense, that is what abstraction means, abstraction from something. And I have never understood the widespread use of the term by everyone, including Picasso himself, Richter, and the curators of the Inventing Abstraction exhibit at MoMA, to mean non-representational. It's as though everyone concedes from the beginning that Picasso was right. And yet, Picasso, for his part, admitted to François Gillot that in the summer of 1910, while at Cadaqués, he came very close to pure painting, as in the portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. But he was always careful to work in some recognizable features into his composition, as you can see. This would imply, however, that if he had not put in the eyes and wavy hair, he'd have successfully avoided something seen, thereby performing a dereliction of duty, but not, after all, an impossibility. Something seen isn't necessarily a point of departure in painting, as the random marks one finds oneself to have made on one's phone while trying to do something else would suggest. But once those marks are there, as Richter will tell us in a moment, they'll remind us of something seen. At this point, having acknowledged Picasso's opinion that representation is the purpose of painting, and having doubted whether representation is possible to escape, I want to introduce the theme that goes beyond my title, the theme of frustration with picturing, with the picturesque in the broadest sense. I paint what I see. What painter hasn't told you that? But suppose you don't want to paint what you see. In Richter's case, I'm going to concede, at least on this one issue, in agreement with Florian von Donnersmarck's quasi-biopic about him, Never Look Away, that the frustration in question is best considered psychoanalytically. But in Plato, this frustration is philosophical, though admittedly once one speaks of frustration, one is already hitting at a psychological component. And it's worth pausing over as an epistemological matter. Plato's Socrates finds material reality itself an unreliable ground, because what is called the real is not only an ephemeral concretization of the ideal, but always already representation framed by the deluded eye. You can see a straight stick refracted in the water and think it is a bent stick. Still, you have more or less direct contact with what you see, which tends to minimize bias. You can walk around an object, for example, whereas the painter can at best only commit the object to a fixed viewpoint. The bed he paints from one side, like Van Gogh, has no other side. Cubism tried to supply the other side in a way that wouldn't have satisfied Plato. And since reality itself is not what the eye sees, but rather an idea of what the eye can only see in a concrete instance, a painter's representation of what the eye sees is always 3 times removed from reality. I take all this from the argument urging the banishment of the poets in Book 10 of the Republic, and in like vein, film studies has often been haunted by the parable of the cave in Book 7, our most prescient evocation of the matinee experience. Yet none of this in itself need trouble anyone, even though the experience of Plato's filmgoer is essentially the experience of ideology. For Plato, the real is the ideal, a notion that is not at all necessary to accept, one that carries us off into the Kandinskyan rationale for abstraction, the spiritual in art. It remains true even for those of us who are less mystical, however, that an artist may wish to avoid representing on the grounds that accurate representation is an impossible mission owing to the bias of the eye. Richter, as virtuoso, is of special interest because critics have often approached him, sometimes with the help of his own testimony, as a practicing theorist of the end of painting. Precursors in this regard being the showman-like but less talented Francis Picabia, and before that, the virtuoso J.M.W. Turner. Richter gives us every possible mode and style, so the argument goes, to show us that even though he is performing each exercise as well as it can be done, it remains a rhetorical gesture, referencing painterliness rather than life, and proving the shortcoming of any mode as representation. And what then, still following Picasso's argument that the inescapable duty of painting is representation, what can possibly remain to be done? But I think Richter is more frustrated, more sympathetically frustrated, he often calls himself sentimental, than this cynical end-of-painting agenda would imply. In these concluding thoughts, I shall apply to visual signs the argument about verbal signs that I first made in a book called A Defense of Poetry, for which I beseeched the art director of the press to find me a cover image that represented nothing. Well, that is not nothing. It looks like a window that needs cleaning. But the fact that it could not be nothing, however much it resisted identification, was actually my point. Through its intricacies or evasions of form and reference, the work of art intimates its frustration with the inescapable constraints of representation, whether aesthetic, reportorial, as in Richter's Baader-Meinhof paintings, art historical, or abstract. While all the time it covertly indexes, as best it can, the sheer being there of the actuality, the Ding an sich, to which it has no immediate access. On the one hand, Richter blurs his photorealism, most famously Tante Mariana, Onkel Rudi, and Herr Heide, while he tells us, on the other hand, that it's in our nature, even in his own nature, to see things in his abstractions, the net effect of which, the meeting point of all his seemingly discontinuous gestures, is the partial erasure of what can never be erased altogether. Von Donnersmarck zeroes in on the early blurred photorealist paintings and makes out the case, much to Richter's distaste as it turned out, that his character, Kurt Barnardt's resistance to representing his past traumas, was a screening over, a screen memory. Watching his beloved aunt being dragged into the ambulance that would carry her to her doom, the little boy puts up his hand to cover his eyes with spread fingers, like a camera aperture partly open, finestra in parte aperta, warding off what he can't avoid seeing completely, already in partial erasure of the trauma. Richter has used this trauma theory argument himself to explain away his declared ignorance of any special meaning when painting the photos of the persons from his past whose guilt or victimization he admits having read about later. And that is the argument he must certainly have used in his conversations with von Donnersmarck, described in the New Yorker article about the film. The director turns this reticence into melodrama by making Heide, the character Zebant, the father of Richter Barnardt's first wife, who looks just like the mentally unstable Tante Mariana, the young woman whose killing in the Nazis' euthanasia program was authorized by Zebant, Heide. Those family links and likenesses go way beyond the known facts. It's the privilege of biopics. But it makes the argument about the limits of representation lurid enough. Growing up first under the Nazis and then the communists, von Donnersmarck's character hears lectures from each extreme to the effect that the duty of art is unabstracted representation. Of the decadent art shown as an object lesson in the museums, the Nazi docent says, was hat das mit Kunst zu tun? Kurt Barnard is not likely to fall for that rhetoric, and when his socialist art teacher in Dresden, having earlier given a similar lecture, retorts that Kurt's wish to have a personal style is nothing but ich, Ich, this becomes a rueful joke among Kurt and his friends, that teacher has insisted rightly enough in advance that the expressivity of so-called decadent art, Western art, is never less representational than the objectivity of so-called realist art. Soon Kurt is finally in the West, under his Joseph Beuys-inspired mentor in Dusseldorf, liberated there into total confusion, wandering among Duchampian options and finally standing in front of a blank canvas for days, wondering where and how to make, in both senses, his mark. The arrest of Zebant releases him into the blurred paintings of family photos that confront his traumas obliquely and launch his career. And there, in effect, the film ends. Never Look Away is very crude, but somehow not wrong, I feel, about the representational frustration that offsets, but perhaps also explains, what Francis Guérin, writing about Richter, calls the urge to represent. Why? Richter, with his almost belligerent virtuosity, seems to ask. Why do I have to be subservient to something as tawdry and horrific as reality? Horrific is one of his favorite terms of distaste, and in the Robert Storr interview, he uses it, for example, to describe the Biedermeier surround implied by his chandelier. And yet the world as we see it, and as Richter can paint it, is beautiful. And it is like a good picture, picturesque, if you will. And the social bodies limping through history, for their part, are tragic, composing themselves too in genres like a picture. But wouldn't it be a release, a kind of exhilarating freedom to encounter an actuality that was just itself, that was not, in other words, always like a picture? If there is a kind of subtle gloom suffusing Richter's glorious body of work, it is because of what it tells us. There is no un-picturesque. Thank you.